Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation of child welfare and the overrepresentation of Indigenous people. Canadian child welfare, defined as a system of children's aid societies established by provincial and territorial governments, at times in partnership with private organizations, to provide service that supplement or substitute for parental care and supervision. Seems legit, but then I wanted to research what the definition of Aboriginal child welfare is. Find a definition similar to the one we just read, but there's one vital addition. There's been controversy about systemic genocide in child protection systems enforced with Aboriginal children in post-colonial societies. If you're wondering what systemic genocide is when discussing child welfare, it's forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. To try and comprehend how child welfare for Aboriginals became a function of systemic genocide, we have to look at the history between Indigenous people and European settlers. After the horrific events of colonization, there came about an idea of residential school, supported by many, but ultimately put into action by John A. Macdonald. He served as the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs and was responsible for overseeing the establishment of resident schools. Key figures felt as though such actions needed to be taken to eradicate, quote, the Indian problem, as stated by John A. Macdonald. Here's part of a speech in the House of Commons laying out the aim for residential schools. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and although he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He's simply savage who can read and write. These images are just a small glimpse of the atrocities the Canadian government forced upon the Indigenous people. Following is a brief video about residential school system in Canada. Indigenous children forced into residential schools were not given the opportunity to properly socialize with their family and culture. Vital lessons that would have been taught by family and community, sources of guidance and positive role models, were not available during their growth. So upon returning home, many were vulnerable and lacked the necessary tools and coping strategies to address feelings of loss of self, loss of identity, depression, suicidal thoughts, such as having access to sweat lodges to help heal and cleanse. This in turn would affect how residential school survivors would raise their own families. Instead of relying on teachings from family and community, many resorted to their experiences in the residential school, where relationships were dictated by abuse and stern approaches, with limited, if any, acts of love or care. This marks the beginning of multiple generations of intergenerational trauma, trauma that is passed down behaviorally from generation to generation. This is when the government took action in helping Indigenous families stricken in poverty, less than ideal living situations, where many were suffering with illnesses such as depression and addiction. The response wasn't to aid and support the Indigenous with assistance in housing, education, health, or mental illness. Their solution was to take the children out of their homes yet again. Around 20,000 children were once again forced to live with non-Indigenous people, repeating the damaging effects of residential schools, depriving another generation of their cultural identity. This time became known as the 60s scoop. Anyone can see a direct correlation between the number of Aboriginal youth in foster care and the number of Aboriginal youth incarcerated. Many run away from foster or group homes, some unable to return to a supportive and safe family home, and end up living on the streets, with the risk of becoming affiliated to gang activity. Some commit crimes of poverty or crimes of desperation. For example, let's say an Indigenous young woman gets caught riding the C train without a ticket and fined $150. If she has any previous offenses, she may be incarcerated at the Calgary Remand Center. One also has to take into account the fact that there is systemic racism in the Canadian justice system, where a non-Indigenous youth may not be charged for the same crime committed. I'd like to introduce you to Ryan Beardy, who partook in a discussion panel about Indigenous incarceration rates, along with Pam Palmer and Cora Morgan. Ryan was once a career criminal who is now in his 30s and currently in his second year of university. He describes a life of criminal activity in and out of the Canadian justice system, talks about the racism he encountered daily, along with periods of depression and suicidal thoughts. He shares how going to prison felt familiar because the population was mostly brown, how he chose a life of criminal activity based on what he saw growing up, and began to idolize that lifestyle, and how his upbringing affected his life choices.
You would be you talked about making mistakes as a kid. Do you still feel like the onus is on just Indigenous people, like as individuals, as to why we end up in prisons?
Wow, that's a broad question there. I think there's a plethora of reasons. I think there's a lot of onus on the individual. I think it really boils down to the values and belief systems. But you got to think, where do we develop these values and belief systems? We get them from early childhood experience, and that's what we're experiencing here. Is we're taking the youth from the families, and we're expecting the youth to not have these traumatic experiences and not have that affect their lives. But it does. It did with me, and I think you could trace that also to the community, to the social problems. You could further trace that to colonization, to residential school system, trauma. I think it's a broad subject there, and it takes a plethora. It takes the community as a whole to come together.
Do you have family that were affected?
Canada needs to take a more progressive approach to finding safe, supportive Indigenous communities for the Indigenous youth and social welfare. It's time that their cultural identity is restored and encouraged from their community. In turn, future paths will be those of strong family ties, spiritual belief, and cultural values, which will encourage healing, growth, and future success outside of the Canadian criminal justice system.